Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Patrick Lewis, the Director of Collections and Research at the Pilsen Historical Society. Thank you again for joining us for Phyllis George, Shattering the Ceiling. Our two speakers today, Paul Volpini is an author, journalist, and educator. He's the author of numerous books, most recently Streetball is Life, Lessons Learned on the Asphalt. And Lenny Shulman is an Emmy Award-winning television and film writer. He's the author of Justify, 111 Days to Triple Crown Glory, Ride of Their Lives, The Triumphs and Turmoil of Today's Top Jockeys, and Head-to-Head, Conversations with a Generation of Horse Racing Legends. Please join me in welcoming Paul Volpini and Lenny Shulman.
Well, hello. Thank you for coming on a weekday morning. It's great to see you all. By the way, it's Volponi, like a horse, and it's great because we're here in Kentucky. It just really works out well. So I want to thank you for Lenny and myself. And you know, it's amazing we're here today. I know Lenny for a long time. Lenny has been my editor at the Blood Horse, a Kentucky publication that covers the sport of kings for 2 decades. And when you cover horse racing, what really happens is it is such a sport steeped in tradition. It goes back so many decades that eventually you begin to lose the people you've always wanted to interview. I had a list of maybe 20 or 30 people who had passed away over the last decade. When they were gone, I said, oh, I missed my time with them. I never got the story I really wanted. I actually had a list. And then one day I looked up and Phyllis George was gone. So young, so vital, so sick, and she kept it to herself and just her closest friends for the longest time. But I picked up a phone and I called Lenny, talking about some other story. And just before the end, I turned to him and said, you know, I missed my time with Phyllis George. I always wanted to schedule her, always wanted to find her, talk about that great story. She was at Belmont Park when Ruffian ran against Foolish Pleasure, when it was the battle of the sexes, and how amazing that CBS chose her for something called the Battle of the Sexes. And I'd seen the tape on YouTube, and I always wanted to speak to her about that day, about Ruffian passing away. So I turned to Lenny in that phone conversation. I said, by the way, I missed out on Phyllis George. And Lenny said to me, we have someone here at the Blood Horse who's in her family, related to her by marriage. And I said to myself, okay, that's fantastic. Maybe there's a way in. We finished our conversation and I hung up with him. And now to really make it make sense, I have to take you back about 1.5 years before that phone conversation. You see, Lenny, a terrific sports writer, had been everywhere covering Justify, one of the horses that had just won the Triple Crown. And I woke up one morning and I said to myself, I'd love to write something about Justify. And they said, no, not me and Lenny. And then I said, no, Lenny. Lenny was at those places all the time. He was there. Lenny was there before Justified ever ran a single race. Justify's trainer, Bob Baffert, put his arm around Lenny, walked him up to a stall of a horse who had never run before and said, Lenny, this is the horse that's going to win the Triple Crown one day. And it came true. Lenny was in all those places. I said to myself, it's got to be a book Lenny writes. So the next morning I picked up the phone and I called him. And I said to Lenny, who wrote a couple of books before, I said, Len, you've got to write this book. You've got to tell this incredible story of Justify. It has to be you. And he really wasn't into it. But I stayed on that phone for a good 40 minutes, convincing him that he was the only one in the world who could do justice to that story about Justify. Ooh, like the way I did that? Justice, the story about Justify. That's because I'm a writer. Mark that down. And he did write that book. And in the end of the book, when the story is over, I'm proud to say he put one of my inspirations was Paul Volponi. That's because I pushed him into it. So I was 1-for-1 with him on amazing phone calls. Lenny, you've got to write that book. And he did. And it was one of the best books you're ever going to see on a racehorse. So I was 1-for-1 at coming through. So after he told me someone at the Blood Horse was related to Phyllis George, the next day I picked up the phone and I called him and I said, Len, do you remember about 2 years ago when I said to you, you're going to write that book about that horse? He said, yeah. I said, I was right, wasn't I? He said, yeah, Paul, you were right. Well, we're going to do it this time as a team. We're going to write a book about Phyllis George. And this time, he didn't argue with me a lick. He just said, okay. And we started to move forward from that day. So if he didn't give me that resistance, you guys wouldn't be sitting here this morning. I'd be back in New York City. So thank you for just running along with me on that. So I had never met Phyllis. I had seen her on tape. I'd grown up with her on the NFL Today. And I started to look into Phyllis George. I said, could we really write a book about someone neither one of us had ever met? And you know, I went back and I started watching tape on her. And the first thing I saw was the 1976 NFL championship game. Her partners on the NFL Today played a trick on her. They turned to her right at the moment, right before they were supposed to talk to the audience. They said, Phyllis, you did that interview on that guy. We're about to run it. And she said, no, what are you talking about? I never did. They were on national TV playing a prank on her. And I said to myself, how close must they be as a team that they could do that, right? And I was wondering what the people in the truck parked outside the stadium were thinking. And I'll tell you that later on, even though that event happened 50 years ago, I got to talk to two of the people who were sitting in that truck and what they were thinking. That was really cool for me. But Phyllis, the thing I learned about her right off the bat, when she became Miss America, the women's lib movement hated her. She was public enemy number one. She stood for everything the women's lib movement did not like. Several years later, when she broke the glass ceiling on the NFL Today, being the first woman sports broadcaster, she went from being their villain to their heroine. What an amazing turnaround in a short amount of time. And I thought about what it took for that personality, that person to do that. And you know what? She was amazing. And Lenny's going to tell you a little bit about her childhood and where she grew up. Len?
Good morning. I'm Lenny Shulman. Most of what Paul said is true. So 50 years, when considering it, context of history, blink of an eye, but you know, for all of us, 50 years is a pretty good chunk of our lifetime. It was 50 years ago today that Phyllis George changed the world of sports broadcasting. Not only her presence, but how it was presented to the public. 50 years ago, we never saw or heard a woman on a sports broadcast, really any broadcast team, including news. Today, you turn on a sports game of any sport, anywhere, you rarely don't have a woman as part of that team. Phyllis George changed that world. Someone had to be the first. Someone needed to open the door and then burst through it. And that someone had to be the right someone. And that was Phyllis George. In that sense, she was the Jackie Robinson of her field. You know, someone had to take those slings and arrows and the verbal abuse, and it came. When when you think about football, some of the most popular announcers through the years are people like John Madden and Howard Cosell and Keith Jackson and Chris Berman. And out of all of those people, nobody ever questioned their weight. But Phyllis George, after she gave birth, oh my God, she gained weight. It became a national issue with people actually criticizing her because of her weight. And she was still about 300 pounds less than John Madden. But these are the kind of things, these are the kinds of slings and arrows and abuse that, Phyllis had to take. Same way Jackie Robinson had to take it. And it couldn't have been any Black person to break the color barrier in baseball. It had to be somebody of a certain temperament who wasn't going to get trapped into answering the bigots and the haters and everybody else. It had to be a special person. And that was Phyllis George. And she not only took the abuse from the public, she also took it from the people she covered and the people she worked with. And still, she had to persevere, and that was Phyllis George. Phyllis was a prototypical American story, really, as a remarkable life carved from rather normal beginnings. Someone ought to check the water down in Denton, Texas, because back when Phyllis was born, it was a small town, maybe 30,000 people. Denton produced two Miss Americas, Sly Stone, a superstar in the world of music, and Sheridan, who was a star in Hollywood for many, many years, and 5 or 6 professional athletes. So it's an amazing record for a small town. Even though Phyllis came from a very working class family, her parents rounded up the funds to send her at a very early age, and I mean maybe 6 or 7, to study piano with a woman named Isabel Ciante, who was a world-class pianist who happened to be teaching at a local college there. It's a recurring theme in American culture, the overbearing parent. I'll say overbearing, it could be a nicer word, it could be a less nice word, but a parent who's determined to drive his or her child in a certain direction. The American cinema is full of rather extreme cases. If you've ever seen Robert Duvall in The Great Santini, or Carl Malden in Fear Strikes Out, or Joan Crawford with a coat hanger. It's a recurring theme in American culture. I used to be in Hollywood working, and I saw the showbiz mothers bring their daughters in to be child actresses at the age of 5 and 6. Children's show I was working at, Jennifer Love Hewitt started as a 5-year-old. A woman named Sarah Ferguson, who became better known as Fergie of the Black Eyed Peas, started on that show. And a guy named Mario Lopez, who's famous for being Mario Lopez. I don't know what he does, but he was on that show as well. Anyway, Louise George had big designs for her daughter. She made sure she got the musical training and the theatrical training and the academic training. And that was part of it. Phyllis had that charisma. She had that special it. She had that natural comfort with people. She had a natural beauty to her, both inside and out. She was the cheerleader. She was the most popular girl in her class. She was one of the gang. We talked to a half dozen of her childhood friends. She hung out, she played flag football, she watched the guys play basketball and gossiped and did all that. But when it came to them going to the park and drinking, Thunderbird wine at night, no, that she was not part of that. Her mother wouldn't let her be part of that. It came to dating guys, it only went up to a very certain level before mom put the kibosh on anything that she didn't like. So there was no misbehaving to Phyllis. Her ascension in the public eye seemed almost inevitable. But it came with great benefits as well as great costs. For the rest of her life, she was always haunted by what her mother thought of her. Every situation was filtered through, what would mom think? What would mom think of me now? But that's the price. Those are the pluses and the minuses as you go forward. If we ever considered the odds against what it takes to become a famous actor or a sports hero or a Miss America, we wouldn't even dream of trying to do it. The odds are always astronomical against it. But it takes drive, it takes pure confidence, and it takes some naivete as well. And Phyllis's background provided her with all of that. And I'm going to hand it back to Paul to take you through some of her early accomplishments.
Well, here's a picture we're all pretty familiar with. If you're a Phyllis George fan, Miss America. So Phyllis doesn't become Miss Texas the first time around. She loses. And in the end, she's really happy she loses because you get one shot at being Miss America and she didn't think she was ready. So the next time around, she really was. She got to Atlantic City and, you know, she really played that naive card. Oh, I didn't know the boardwalk was really made of boards. And, right, her high school theater teacher, Opal Hall, had worked on her relentlessly to lose that Texas twang, right? She was told, if you're ever going to be someone, if you're ever going to go somewhere, you need to lose that. But you got to see her with Bert Parks. Once they get down to 8 contestants, you can go on YouTube and watch it. She's playing that Texas twang for everything it's worth. So finally, right, Miss America, they start to whittle down and Phyllis is still there. And then comes the moment. She's there with Miss South Carolina and the first runner-up, Miss South Carolina, and Phyllis is amazed. Oh, no, it couldn't possibly be me. Pamela Eldridge, the reigning Miss America from Michigan, puts the crown on her head, and you could see her start to struggle. Phyllis is taller than Pamela Eldridge. You could see Pamela Eldridge start to struggle to get it on. Phyllis takes that walk. Bert Parks sings, "There she is, Miss America," and says, "Go meet your subjects." Phyllis gets about a third of the way down the runway and the crown falls off and breaks. She quickly picks it up undeterred, smiles broadly at the crowd, and continues forward on her reign. And it's going to be a great reign. All Miss Americas always wound up the very next night on Johnny Carson. And some of them were slayed because Carson liked to make fun of Miss America. He noted that all the Miss Americas had at least 3 names: Betty Ann Sue, Bobby Ann Jean, and that was no different with Phyllis. Phyllis and George. Matter of fact, Carson's favorite one was Kitty and Litter. Phyllis was smart. Phyllis had watched Carson. Phyllis loved Carson, and she went on there ready to do battle, right? Probably Carson's best move on a former Miss America. One showed up with the crown in a towel, right? And she put the towel down, and the towel said the Barclay Hotel, where she had been the night before in Atlantic City. And she opened it up to show Johnny the crown, and Johnny came up with the quick assessment: oh, Miss America's a towel thief. Yes. So when Phyllis came on, she knew she was going to get razzed by Johnny about dropping the crown, and she embraced it. She said, "John, you're going to talk to me about being the klutzy Miss America, but people are always going to remember me because of that." And Phyllis went on her reign for a year. And that women's lib movement who was looking at Phyllis, she was looking back at them, and it happened in DeKalb, Illinois. It was very cold. Phyllis was presenting something that Miss Americas do. She was cutting the ribbon on some factory or doing something, and the protesters were outside. It was like 6 degrees out. Phyllis walked out into the 6 degrees, walked up to the line of protesters, says, "Why don't you ladies come on in? We have hot coffee inside. I'll sit with you. I'll hear your grievances, and I'll tell you what moved me to become Miss America. So right away, we saw that thing in Phyllis. We saw that trying to close boundaries, trying to be open, trying to communicate with people. And by the end of her term, as all Miss Americas did during that time period, Phyllis went to Vietnam. She decided who would go with her, who would the other Miss Americas in her pageant. And Phyllis was smart enough and clued in enough to pick Cheryl Brown. Cheryl Brown was the first African-American contestant in Miss America. She was Miss Iowa. Cheryl Brown grew up in New York. And at some point before becoming Miss Iowa, she moved out there. And the people in Iowa were really upset that Miss New York had moved to Iowa to take the crown of somebody who should have been Miss Iowa. And now they were sending the African-American woman to be the first Miss American pageant. But undeterred, Phyllis made sure that she went with her to Vietnam. And they had a great time. And I'll show you some. There's Phyllis with the crown, owning it completely. There's Bert Parks in the background. And here's one of the posters for the show in Vietnam. There's Phyllis in the mini dress and the boots. Here she is shaking hands. And then eventually she gets to the NFL today. By the way, when Phyllis did the show in Vietnam, one of the things she made sure was to put the kind of music in the show that young people would like. They gave her someone to look after the music from a different generation who wanted some standards in. But Phyllis, as Miss America, had a little bit of gravitas, and she made sure they had some music the young folks would like. Phyllis moves to New York and gets chosen to go on the NFL Today. It's an amazing place. It's such a vehicle. Football taking over the homes of people everywhere on Sunday, and they get to see Phyllis. It doesn't go well for her at first. She starts to do interviews with athletes, and none of the producers really want to work with her. The producers are saying to themselves, why do we have this woman doing this? And the producers are not giving them their best. And she's almost out of opportunities until she meets a producer named Louis Schmidt, who really embraces the idea of working with Phyllis. And once he comes along, Phyllis does some amazing interviews. She interviews Joe Namath, who gets called out a minute and a half after she starts the interview. But she asked enough good questions first that they were able to cut the tape and splice it together and really get a good interview. And then once she got that under her belt and people wanted to be interviewed by her, she got her favorite, Roger Staubach from the Dallas Cowboys. Texas girl gets to interview the Cowboy quarterback. How does it become famous? She turns to Roger Staubach and says, "You like sex as much as Joe Namath does, don't you? You just like it with your wife." And he goes for it. And he embraces it, and it becomes really one of the most famous interviews ever. Here's her team: Brent Musburger, Irv Cross. So Phyllis is the first woman broadcaster on a national sports network, and Irv Cross is really the first African-American man on such a telecast. So CBS is breaking the barrier in two places. By the way, for those of you who don't know, the term the glass ceiling, Marilyn Loden in 1978 coined that phrase. Whoever was supposed to speak at this conference for the New York Telephone Company called in sick that day, and they tapped Marilyn Loden on the shoulder, a young person just working her first job there, and they sent her down to be part of the panel. And out of nowhere, Marilyn said, "Yes, we need to break the glass ceiling." So quite a coincidence to get that term. And that was the first time she recalled ever saying those words. And that phrase just took off from there, slowly started to build momentum, and we have it with us. And here's the famous cover of People magazine. There are a lot of legends about who saw her on this cover and eventually said to themselves, I've got to marry that woman. Lenny's going to take us there.
Yeah, so after laser focusing on her career for a decade, Phyllis finally allowed herself to be wooed. Opposites Attract, however, doesn't even begin to explain her romance with Robert Evans. Evans was a streetwise New York City kid, used to skip out of school to do radio shows, a voice actor on radio. He moved to Hollywood, became a B-movie star playing matadors and such. Was doing considerably better off screen than he was on screen. He had affairs with older women like Ava Gardner and Lana Turner, and also married a couple of younger models. So Evans was quite the player. Paramount Pictures at the time, we think of it as a major studio, but it was nearing bankruptcy, and its corporate owners, who was Gulf and Western, would probably wanted it to continue into bankruptcy for tax purposes, so they hired Robert Evans to run it. It was like the movie The Producers. We just need it to go away as quickly as possible and fail. And a funny thing happened on the way to bankruptcy. Robert Evans proceeded to produce The Odd Couple, The Godfather, parts 1 and 2, The French Connection, and then he bought a book that every other studio in Hollywood had turned down called Love Story, turned it into a film that made about $20 gazillion and brought Paramount to prominence that nobody could have possibly imagined when this guy who had no experience came to run it. Oh, and by the way, he also married Love Story's star, Ally McGraw, just as an aside, before losing her to Steve McQueen. Anyway, Evans was a player. He was a womanizer. He was a drug abuser. And somehow in 1977, he convinced Phyllis George to marry him. Again, opposites attract. Doesn't even begin to tell the story. Robert Evans wrote a great book called The Kid Stays in the Picture. And it's unusual for me to read from a book that's not ours here, but it gives such insight into Phyllis in a way that I don't think any other source ever does. So this is Robert Evans' autobiography. Shortly after our marriage, Los Angeles Magazine did a story on Phyllis. She was there on the cover, her dimples deep, a football under her arm. The caption read, "What happens when a country girl turned Miss America, hits it big in TV sports, and hooks up with Hollywood's most notorious Prince Charming." Evans writes, "Disaster, that's what. Everything Phyllis wanted was right, but she couldn't fight the biggest mismatch of the decade. When being interviewed on national TV, Phyllis cooed, 'I know I'm not the first Mrs. Evans, but I'm definitely the last.'" Poor Phyllis. She was in for one hell of a surprise. Square, let's just say she made Mary Tyler Moore look like Madonna. And he goes on to say, "I can't say a bad thing about Phyllis, but I just couldn't understand what she saw in me. I was everything she was not. She was everything I would have liked to have been. My goal was to clean up my act, and she was the inspiration. But damn it, it's true that you can't teach an old dog new tricks, and I was one hell of an old dog. The more I told her I was wrong for her, the more she wanted to prove it would work." The marriage lasted, and you could see the attraction on the surface. There are tennis games with Dustin Hoffman and Warren Beatty, and travel to almost every continent on the planet. It was an interesting life, but it was a doomed marriage. The interesting part, and I mentioned her mother, Louise, earlier, and her domineering sense. and what Phyllis carried of it through the rest of her life. Robert Evans writes, after the divorce, my biggest surprise of the entire relationship was her mother calling me and pleading, "What did Phyllis do wrong? I know it's her fault." My persuasive best was needed to convince her that Phyllis's only fault was choosing me. So it was 2 years when Phyllis got back on the romance horse. Clearly, she was attracted to strong, type A driven men, and John Y. Brown Jr. certainly fit that. He was a son of a Kentucky politician, a star athlete in Lexington, and an entrepreneur from Jump Street. In high school, he started selling vacuums and encyclopedias door to door. And by the time he was in law school, he had a staff of workers working under him. Life changed when a man named Harlan Sanders came to him for tax advice one day. And shortly after, Brown had bought out Sanders' fried chicken recipe and a couple of restaurants that he owned, causing Sanders to brag how he just took some city slicker for $2 million. A couple of years later, after Brown had syndicated the company and franchised it, Kentucky Fried Chicken had 4,500 outlets throughout the world. And a few years after that, when Brown sold the company, he took home approximately $25 million. That might be a conservative estimate. It took 2 months of courtship before Phyllis Brown said yes and married John Y. in 1979. Again, there was great excitement during their honeymoon in the Caribbean. Brown was weighing whether or not to run for governor of Kentucky. They were in the resort lobby one day and ran into Jacqueline Onassis, who told John Y. how much he reminds her of Jack. The honeymoon ended early, and the campaign was on, announced on the tarmac at the Louisville airport when they got back. Well, people flocked to see this couple as they campaigned throughout Kentucky, the dashing entrepreneur and the beauty queen. And there were comparisons to John and Jackie. This was Camelot 2 to everybody. The national media descended on Kentucky. Phyllis George would hop on stage and introduce her man and take questions and run the show while John Y. Campaigned. There's no question who the main attraction was, though. The people who covered that campaign, the sore losers who lost that campaign, were all in agreement that the biggest reason John Y. Brown was elected governor of Kentucky was Phyllis George. There's no portfolio for a first lady of the state, little in the way of official duties. Yet Phyllis George embraced this position as an opportunity. After a decade in which she was the center of attention, she set out to perform service and to help others. And in this case, the main beneficiaries were the artists and craftspeople of Kentucky. This is no desk job. Phyllis traveled the back roads and the mountain passes far into Appalachia and changed the lives of thousands of people attending county art festivals and backyard festivals and just making the rounds. And she made markets for these folks. She took their work and brought them to prominence. When John Y. Brown went to New York to speak at the Democratic National Convention in 1980, Phyllis George went along so she could go and lobby the chairman of Bloomingdale's. And when she was done with him, there was an entire floor set up for the artists of Kentucky to sell their work in the middle of Bloomingdale's in Manhattan. Did the same thing at Neiman Marcus in Los Angeles. we were fortunate enough, Paul and I were just so lucky to reach so many people in our research who had been touched by Phyllis in her life, one of whom is a woman named Minnie Atkins. If you're a fan of the Beverly Hillbillies, you know Jed's spent a lot of time whittling out on the front porch, but nobody knew it was a real thing. It actually is. It's an art form. So we were able to talk to Minnie Atkins, and let me just see where we are here. Well, so Minnie was about 88 years old when she talked to me, and she said about Phyllis, "I'll always have wonderful memories of Phyllis because she was such a wonderful person, helped any and everybody who wanted to help themselves. She always loved to come up to my house, and that was when I lived further up in the holler than I do now. She would come out and visit and come to Day in the Country, and everyone always loved to see Phyllis a-coming, you know. She was a spectacular person, and I loved her. She'd done a lot for the arts in Kentucky. She was what brought the arts to Kentucky. She loved people as well as their artwork. If everybody could be like Phyllis George, it would be a good world to live in." Minnie Atkins' work today is in the Smithsonian. It's in museums in New York. It's in the private collections of people like Oprah Winfrey and Barbara Streisand. And that was all because of Phyllis George. Phyllis helped establish the Kentucky Art and Craft Foundation, supporting the state's artists as well as educating children and everybody else. Today, the Kentucky Arts and Crafts Foundation is known as KMAC, and it sits about 2 miles from where we are today on Museum Road. If you go on their website, under founder, it says Phyllis George. Along with everything else, it's certainly one of Phyllis's lasting legacies. And she wasn't done yet. Paul's up here to tell you what came next in her career.
Well, yeah, Lenny's absolutely right. We got so lucky with telephones. We got to call people and ask them what happened 50 years ago, and they seemingly, one after another, picked up the phone and spoke to us. I said, well, who put the crown on Phyllis's head? Pamela Eldridge. She was Miss America from Michigan. Let me look up Pamela Eldridge in Michigan. Let me not even think she got married and changed her name. And let me not even believe she ever moved out of Michigan. Let me just look on the internet and find Pamela Eldridge in Michigan. And I did, and I called her up. And she picked up the phone. I said, hey, is this Pamela Eldridge? She said, yes. She said, are you trying to sell me something? I said, no, ma'am. Were you ever Miss America? She said, I was. Did you put the crown on Phyllis George's head? She said, yes. I said, why did it fall off? And she said, you know, not too many people have ever asked me that. She said, Paul, Phyllis was tall and she was wearing a hairpiece and it was just tough to get that thing in. And when it fell, I felt so bad. I felt horrible that the crown fell off her head. I felt like it was my fault forever. And then I said, gee, let me go back and look at the tape of the following year when it's Phyllis's turn to put the crown on someone else. I wonder if Phyllis really takes a lot of time to do it, so what happened to her doesn't happen to the next Miss America. And I went back and I watched the tape and she did. She really made it going well. And then she whispered something into the ear of the next Miss America and got out of the way, letting that new Miss America take that walk down the aisle. And I said, can I find that Miss America she put the crown on? And I called her up. I found a number. No luck, nothing, no answer. I left a message. 2.5 months later, Laura Lee Schaefer calls my house and says, Paul, you called up an old cell phone. I was about to throw that cell phone out. And my husband turned to me and said, you should look at the messages before you throw that out. And she found my message out of total happenstance and called me back. And I said to her, do you remember what Phyllis whispered in your ear before you took the walk down the runway? She said, I'll never forget it. She said, Paul, she whispered to me, you're in for the ride of your life. So that was just fantastic. By the way, we know football can be a sexist type of sport, and it can be hard for a former Miss America to get along. Don't think Phyllis got away so cleanly. We have a story about a all-star football player who was walking across the field with her. They were shooting what they called the B-roll. She had interviewed this football player, and now they just wanted a shot of them walking across the field. And the football player didn't realize that Phyllis was still mic'd up. And he said to her in no uncertain terms, and I'll clean it up for you, I'd really like to have sex with you, doll. And a lot of people heard that back in the truck. Now, I won't tell you his name because he's not here to defend himself, but you would think she was Miss America. You would think he would ask her out to dinner first. Apparently that did not go so well. So Phyllis moves on from football, right, to co-host the CBS Morning News with Bill Curtis. And we got so lucky to talk to Bill Curtis. And Curtis told us, listen, all the questions anybody ever asked me about Phyllis was how it was to work with a former Miss America. But we really got down to the nitty-gritty about what it was when she walked into that place. And what we learned was everyone at CBS Morning News was incredibly jealous of her. They wanted her to fail. She came in with $1 million contract to broadcast the morning news. She had never worked in news in her life, and everyone in that newsroom was jealous, angry, and wanted her to fail. So she was really trying to overcome the odds. In fact, she did not do herself any favors when she walked into a very large meeting, stood up, and said, what I'd really like to do is have a one-on-one interview with Indira Gandhi of India. Unfortunately, Miss Gandhi had been assassinated a year and a half before, and she didn't know. And the people in that newsroom tore her apart for it. But, you know, she made it to the CBS Morning News. Curtis thought she did an outstanding job. We know that Phyllis bumped into Walter Cronkite at a lunch one day and said to him, Mr. Cronkite, I'm really happy to be in news. I really want to try to go far. And Cronkite nearly snapped her head off, said, I'm into news for the sake of news, not for Hollywood, and just walked away from her. So it was something she had to absorb. And then at some point during her tenure in the morning news, a couple walked in off the street. They had been making the rounds at several of the big shows. The couple had accused each other of rape, and someone had gone to jail, and now they were out of jail, and the couple were trying to kind of parlay it into some sort of real commercial thing that they could work with. And without being prepared, they asked Phyllis to interview the two of them. And at some point, she said to the two of these people, can't we just forget about what happened and hug it out together? And Phyllis was really, really taken to task for that. Everyone who wanted Phyllis to fail jumped on that moment and really used it to downgrade her performance. And she did not last much longer at the CBS Morning News. But she did move on. She did a lot of Phyllis George specials on the Nashville network. And as you might expect, some of the people she interviewed kind of fell in love with her. They couldn't get Willie Nelson to stop calling her after he interviewed her. And the same with David Copperfield. Okay? So Len, you're going to take us a little deeper in her life. We're going to talk about this disease she had and how she kept it to herself.
I think Bill Clinton was another one who fell in love with her during, not surprisingly, during the interview, portion. Phyllis had two children, Lincoln, who is an entrepreneur, takes after his father that way. And also a daughter, Pamela, who, if you watch CNN, particularly on the weekends, you will notice a dimpled woman who looks exactly like her mom, Pamela Brown, is an anchor on CNN and a reporter, and quite accomplished, and certainly had the counsel of her mother coming up and has run with it, and is extremely gifted. When Lincoln was very young, he remembers being outside Cave Hill, their mansion in Lexington, one day, and his mom kind of doubled over and got sick, and he didn't quite understand it. Way back in the 80s, Phyllis was detected to have a form of leukemia, and lived with it for the rest of her life. And as Paul alluded to before, didn't tell anybody. Nobody knew about this whatsoever. She soldiered on bravely. It got very bad, obviously, the last few years. But the thing about her last years that strike me is because she lived them in a way that I've always thought I wanted to live mine. She made so many great friends through the years, and accomplished people. Kenny and Marianne Rogers, of course, Kenny Rogers, the great singer, and Marianne Rogers, who was an original member of Hee Haw, actually, and had an acting career. They were great friends. Sherry Lansing, who became the first woman to head a movie studio in Hollywood. Tom and Edwina Johnson. Tom Johnson was the publisher of the Dallas Herald News, Morning News, whatever the paper is, and started CNN with Ted Turner. These were the people who were Phyllis's closest friend. And what she would do, she would take like 2 months at a time and go around the country and live with them. And it's something I always thought of wanting to do. It's like, wouldn't it be neat to, go for 2 weeks every, visit 25 friends every year and live with them and hang out with them. And I thought, what a great way to live your life. And Phyllis George did it. And to me, it's almost that beautiful naivete that, was with her from childhood, to be able to just go and hang out and do that. And I thought that was just amazing. Everybody who Phyllis touched, and certainly the friends that I mentioned and everybody else who didn't know her quite as well, every one of them commented, of course, on her great smile, but also just her kindness. The way when she looked at you, you were the only person in the universe to her. The way she would walk into a room and just be the center of it, but be so kind and giving at the same time to everybody else. The last years were lived with great grace and great beauty, as the rest of her life contained. She lived to be able to see one of her grandchildren. Unfortunately, the second came along during COVID, and Phyllis was in the hospital and really could never visit with the second grandchild, but her two children were with her when she passed. And her favorite song that she always sang to the grandchildren and children were "You Are My Sunshine," and they were able to sing that back with her and tell her how much they loved her before she passed. So it was all with great grace and all with great giving, and so many legacies this woman left behind for us. And I'm so glad that Paul and I were able to touch upon this and visit with so many of the people of her life. And we'd be so happy to answer any questions that you have now at this point. Yes, sir. Oh, thank you.
If possible, for our folks joining online, if you could go up to that mic. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Benham Sims, and I live here in Louisville. And I am here with my cousins, Laura. Laura, if you'd stand up. Laura is a very well-known advocate. She worked for the Domestic Violence Center here in Louisville for many years and is retired.
And is the niece of John White Brown.
And I'm the nephew of
Junior.
John Y. Brown.
Okay.
And then Kay, married to our cousin Bruce, was a teacher here for special needs, and I have a Down syndrome brother. I was real reluctant to come to this, being that she was my aunt and being somewhat afraid of maybe how a family member would be presented. You all presented her with such grace, such kindness, such warmth. I'm going to call Lincoln and I'm going to call Pam, and I'm sure they'll join in with me to tell them what a wonderful job you all did. And thank you. Thank you so very, very much. Lincoln and Pam have lost so much in the last 3 years. And I think it would bring them a sense of healing to know the love and respect you showed their mother. And I thank you all for that.
Thank you so much. And just so you know, I won't go too far into this, but I've had wonderful conversations with Lincoln, who decided not, I think it was a little fresh for him, and decided he didn't want to, contribute. But he was certainly didn't hinder us in any way going forth with the story, which we always appreciated. And like I said, he was terrific, and I so enjoyed meeting him. And we'd love to meet Pam as well. So anyway, thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
A wonderful question. Yes.
The $1 million amount always sticks in, I think, people's minds. I thought they just talked about that with Barbara Walters, who was, I thought, the first female who did nighttime news and got the $1 million salary. Where do they fit between Phyllis and Barbara in terms of breaking into or getting $1 million, or was because she was in the morning and Barbara was at night? And
yeah, I think the real only difference is Phyllis made her name somewhere else. So when she came into the hard news division, there have been so many people there who'd worked so long and so hard and had their eyes on a job like that. I think, in some way they were just upset that an outsider got it. Barbara Walters really had done a lot of hard news in her time before she got promoted to the position she did. And I think that's the real difference in the amount of support each one of them got from their coworkers.
did Barbara get the $1 million salary first before Phyllis, or do you know? The time frame?
Connie Chung might have actually been the first. I'm not sure whether it was Barbara. It might have been Connie Chung who was the first nighttime network newswoman. Barbara would have gotten established before Phyllis, because when Phyllis started doing those network specials, they were kind of patterned on the Barbara Walters specials, and Phyllis even made the statement that if I could be half as good at this as Barbara Walters, then I'd have been a success. So Barbara had established herself by the time Phyllis had hit the news arena.
Well, I was so appreciative for you all sharing some of your research process and some of the successes that you had in calling people up and reestablishing these connections. I wonder who were some of the tougher individuals for you all to track down, or maybe somebody that you tried to get in touch with for a while, but they just slipped away.
Yeah, well, we never got to talk to Brent Musburger, which was a real disappointment. He ducked us at every turn. We had him wired up. We had his nephew, we had his brother, we had his cousin, and we just couldn't get to him. And you know what? We were so lucky to get to so many people who were there. I actually talked to the gentleman who fired Phyllis for CBS News. I found him and I said, well, what was the conversation like? And, you know, he gave it to me in straight terms. You know, she was a little unhappy where she was. We were a little disappointed, and we made a break. And, you know, it's interesting when that much time goes by, that people remember these things. And we got so many wonderful things about Phyllis that we've come to realize now, like when people went away with her to a spa, and then at the end of the week, they immediately drove to a supermarket and bought a 6-pack of donuts and ate them before they got to the register. They're the types of kind of really cool things people might have not have said to us if she were still here. So we got some really interesting, endearing things. And, you know, for the two of us who never, ever spoke to her, who never met her, to have gone this deep in her life and hear this many things about her and to put it together, it's kind of a special feeling, right?
Yeah. We were lucky enough to find one of the Kentucky state policemen who was assigned to the governor's detail and who would travel with Phyllis by plane back to New York to tape the NFL Today every week. And Phyllis would always take the bulkhead seat at the front of the plane, and he would be sitting behind her. And Phyllis would be studying her notes, and the lieutenant would be eating his meal. And when Phyllis would get done with the page, she'd flip it over the seat into his mashed potatoes. And of course, he was plainclothes, and he just made the statement that those people on the plane were looking at me like I must have been the most zen son of a bitch on the planet. So yeah, we got a lot of great stuff from people, and going even back to her childhood friends, they were just so anxious to want to share and talk, and so proud of what she became. And it's a good thing we're both reporters, because it took a lot of reporting research. This 50 years back we're going. We were really fortunate to get the breadth that we did.
And the interesting thing is, and no one here today has asked us, and few people ever ask us, how did two men come to write this story about this glass ceiling shattering woman? Why did two men do this?
Yeah, well, that's easy. Nobody else came forward to do it first. So.
Yeah, it's all about passion, right? We saw the story. For me, I was hooked when she was the public enemy #1 to the women's lib movement, and then became their heroine several years later. That was the hook for me. But so gender really never came into it.
Well, I think sharing some of those stories is really an enticement to walk over and grab a copy of the book, continue this conversation over a signing. Thank you both so much for coming to the Pilsen today.